everyone, and welcome to the 19th session of Chamber Talk. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, this is Sultan Hatoum from Abu Dhabi Chamber of Commerce and Industry. We are getting closer to the end of the program, with only 4 sessions to go, excluding this session, of course. These represent the last sessions with our partners of the program. So we had the last session with PwC on Sunday, today with KPMG, and the remaining 4 sessions will be one with EY, one with Deloitte, and 2 with Saloom and Partners, given that Saloom's session on the Eid got shuffled to the end of the program. So as mentioned, today's session with KPMG is their 4th and last of the program. We've had very successful 3 sessions before on interesting topics, and today's session would be of no difference. Given that we're running the last session with our partners, allow me please to take a few minutes of your time to thank KPMG speakers and the wider team that have been working with us behind the scene on the success of these sessions. A big thank you first goes to Nader Haffar, the chairman of KPMG Lower Gulf, who has been a great supporter to the initiative and to the chamber in general. The thanks goes as well to the admin and technical team represented by Renee Gopal, Claire Mulleron, Harsha Thawani, Claire Gill, and James Babb. Excuse me if I spelled any of those wrong. And of course, is extended to the main speakers that we've hosted during the last couple of weeks, starting by Yusuf Hassan, who had a very successful session with more than 450 attendees discussing accounting and disclosure implications of COVID-19 and what companies should be doing. Anurag Bajpai, Anshul Gupta, and Vikrant Rohaji, who covered COVID-19 and changing consumer behavior. What can the UAE consumers and retail business do to prepare their organizations for the future? Abbas Basrai, Adil Abid, and Slim Ben Ali, who covered financial and business impacts of COVID-19 in financial service sector. And finally, ahead of today's session, to Timothy Wood, Wajdi Harzallah, and Paul Van Der, who will discuss digitalization and investing in technology resilience post-COVID-19. Please note that if you've missed any of the above sessions or any of Chamber Talks' previous webinars, you can watch them again on the Chamber's YouTube channel. I would also like to remind you that this session is accessible in Arabic as we speak on the link that the team will share or has already shared on the chat box. And that you can as well submit your questions to the panel via the Q&A box, as we will dedicate the last 15 minutes of the session to cover all these questions. As in the last session with PwC and the ones to come with EY and Deloitte, we've decided to dedicate the time that was allocated in the intro statement to give the audience some flavor of what they'll be expecting on the session, to a thank you message to the working teams and give them credit for the hard work behind the scenes. I'm not even referring to the team at the chamber, which is spread over different departments from marketing and communication, events, design, IT, and others. So as mentioned earlier, the panel from KPMG today will discuss digitalization and investing in technology resilience post-COVID-19. All what I can tell you is that, yes, it will provide a holistic overview on the topic, but it will dig deep in 3 major sectors: healthcare, education, and financial services. A brief intro about our speakers before I pass it to them. We have with us today Timothy Wood, a partner and head of cybersecurity in the UAE and Oman. Tim has 20 years of experience working with national governments and critical national infrastructure clients, delivering complex responses to the cyber threat, reduce cyber risk, and enhance business resilience in the digital domain. We also have with us Wajdi Harzallah, who is a partner and leads the digital strategy practice at KPMG. Wajdi brings over 25 years of industry and management consulting experience across Europe, North America, the Middle East, and Africa. Prior to joining KPMG, he worked at Booz Allen Hamilton, Booz & Company, and was a member of the MENA leadership team. and before that was with the JE Medical Systems. He also founded or co-founded multiple technology startups. And finally, our third speaker, Paul van der, is an associate director in KPMG's cybersecurity team, responsible for executing and managing cybersecurity and strategic IT engagements. Paul has over 11 years of professional experience in the IT industry, and he combines experience in Big Four and the industry, as we call it once you're out of the Big Four. Paul holds various certificates in the domain. He's a certified information systems auditor, a certified information security manager, and certified in risk information system controls, just to name a few, and I literally mean it. So we're all excited and looking to for this session. Tim, I'm going to pass it to you to kick off the presentation.
Great. Thank you, Sultan, for your kind introductions. So I'd like to kick off by saying what a pleasure it is to be here talking in partnership with the Abu Dhabi Chamber about our topic today, digitalization and investing in technology resilience post-COVID-19. We're going to be covering this topic in three sections, and we have, as Sultan highlighted, about 40 minutes of content for you here today. So I'm going to kick off spending about 10 minutes talking really about the context of COVID-19 and the key themes that have come out of the pandemic that we think are enduring, that businesses need to be aware of. I'm then going to hand over to Wejdi, who's going to spend about 15 minutes talking about how organizations are increasingly looking to digital solutions and technology to transform their businesses in this new environment. And then finally, last but by no means least, I'll be handing over to Paul van der, who's going to be talking about the increasing importance of technology resilience and security as the threats have changed in this post-COVID-19 world. So that's what we have planned for you today. So if we move on to the next slide, let's kick off by some setting of the scene. So what this slide really highlights is the changing landscape that KPMG sees due to COVID-19. And as you can imagine, KPMG is a global organization, and we've spent the last few months really looking at and identifying what are the enduring changes that we foresee, not necessarily just in the short term, but the longer term that have come out of the COVID-19 pandemic. And these are the 8 themes that you can see on this slide. Range from very obvious ones. So if you look on the left-hand side, kind of ways of working, perhaps many of you who are attending this webinar are doing it from home. You're probably spending a lot more time on Microsoft Teams than you did previously. And that's fundamentally a significant change to the ways of working that are directly off the back of the pandemic. But I guess less obviously, there are also some trends which we believe have been around for many years or decades, but are increasingly important in this kind of post-COVID environment. So if we take, for example, deglobalization on the right-hand side, this has been happening for many years as many nations look more insular and start questioning the likes of some of the global institutions such as NATO, such as the World Health Organization. And what we're seeing is in many of these trends are actually continuing and becoming more important in this new environment. But I think if you look across these 8 trends, what is critically, what we see from our perspective is success and failure is going to be really driven by how organizations respond to these individual themes and how they increasingly become agile, so that as these themes change and develop over time, they're agile to respond to that new operating environment, that new normal, if you like. And we firmly believe that technology is a key enabler to that business agility and the increasing resilience that we expect in the services that we offer our customers and our staff. I'll just talk through a couple of examples where technology is really being used to enable businesses to work in this new normal, in this new working environment. So if we look at the third column, supply chain and manufacturing, I'm sure everybody has seen the impact in their working lives on the supply chain from COVID-19. You just need to look at the healthcare sector where, you know, the issue with sourcing the appropriate masks or even ventilators had a huge impact as the pandemic unfolded. So what we're seeing is organizations and businesses looking to improve the agility of their supply chains. They're looking to improve the resilience and actually transparency, because often many organizations we were speaking to didn't realize they had suppliers because they were perhaps suppliers of suppliers of suppliers that significantly impacted their supply chain. So we're working with organizations to use quite a few different types of emerging technology to really help those organizations through IoT or blockchain to provide that visibility and agility on their supply chain. A second example where technology is being used is on the labour force. So obviously this is a theme where the labour market has been hugely impacted with a number of a large percentage of people going on furlough or not being able to go into their work. So, and that's actually impacted services that organisations and businesses offer their customers. So a number of organisations in a recent survey, something like, I think it was 41% of CEOs were looking to accelerate their investment in robotics and automation so that they can ensure that they're continuing to offer the services to the customer that they need to. So, and what they're then doing is then obviously taking the freed up skills to retrain in higher value areas, and often those areas are technology. So this is really just a summary of the landscape that we see and the key themes and how technology can really be an enabler to responding to this changing landscape. So if we move on to the next slide, obviously, as we talk about this, every organisation is impacted in different ways because every sector is impacted in different ways. So this slide here kind of aims to demonstrate how this is our global perspective on how different sectors are impacted by the pandemic. So if you look on the kind of top to bottom, so for the mathematicians, the y-axis of this slide, this is really around the permanence of the change. So the sectors and organisations at the top of this this slide are the ones which we believe have got a relatively long-term impact due to COVID-19. So, for example, both airlines and energy sector, due to the economic downturn and reduction in demand, we see a relatively long-term impact on demand for the services that they offer. However, if you look on the right side, where there has been a permanent change, there's been a significant increase in people using online retail, using telecommunication services, even food delivery. So this is really the flip side, where organisations are seeing significantly increased demand. And I think there's no surprise there that if you look in the top right-hand corner, these are all technology-delivered services in the main. So that's really top to bottom. If we then look across the x-axis, this is really around the pace of recovery of particular sectors and organisations. So, for example, on the right-hand side, if we look at banking and education, the response actually has been relatively, the recovery has been relatively quick, and we believe, you know, we'll go back to the previous levels of demand for these services. Whereas on the left-hand side, if you look at travel or automotive, we think there won't be a fundamental change in the business model, but it may take longer for recovery to get back to pre-COVID levels. So what we're seeing, obviously, as we said, is a lot of the ones where we're seeing high demand, or the sectors where we're seeing high demand, or technology-enabled services. And what we're seeing is many organisations and sectors looking to say if you're on the left-hand side or the bottom of this diagram, how they can develop a hybrid model so that they're both delivering services physically, but also electronically. Something that we are seeing, everybody trying to get into the top right-hand corner. So that's really a bit of context around sectors and what's happening and our perspective on COVID-19. What I'm now going to do is I'm going to pass over to Wejdi to really zoom in on a few sectors and talk about how these sectors are digitizing and transforming their businesses using technology. Wejdi.
Thank you, Tim. Good afternoon, everyone. So we'd like to zoom into three distinct sectors. These sectors have distinct levels of digital maturity. They are at different maturity level from the digital point of view. But more importantly, they are facing very different and specific challenges during the COVID-19 crisis. And we would like to see how they responded to the crisis using particularly technology. And through their response, I would like to show you how some of them will probably have a much longer lasting change to their businesses and potentially even to their business models overall. And so we selected three sectors. If you saw earlier in the previous slide that Tim was explaining, they're all at the bottom right corner in terms of the level of lasting change as well as the pace of recovery. They are at the high level of pace, the high pace of recovery. So if you look at the healthcare, for example, is a sector that is at the heart of the crisis. The healthcare providers and the health system had to respond very quickly to the crisis to control the pandemic and treat the patients and diagnose the patients. The sector has been overwhelmed by the demand of patients and the level of stress in terms of the constraints on the business. But not only, because some parts of the healthcare sector actually were totally halted. If you're talking about the private clinics, for example, and so they were simply shut down. And during that shutdown, obviously, they were under extreme economic or financial stress. There are also implications on patients who, for example, have some chronic diseases and were not able to see their doctors because of the constraints in the health provider. So there are different, even within the health system, there are different challenges depending on the providers and their role during the crisis. And based on that, they responded also fairly differently. And we saw the emergence or the acceleration of digital solutions in different ways for different providers. The second sector we selected is the financial services sector. Obviously, the sector is probably a little bit higher in terms of digital maturity compared to the healthcare. We've all had online banking and mobile banking pretty advanced, or the adoption in those solutions has been quite advanced in many parts of the world, including in the region lately. That said, there are also different types of stress or disruptions to the business, particularly in the banking sector during the crisis, where during the lockdown you were no longer able to go to your banking agency to open an account, or you were no longer, or you were reluctant to use your credit card or to use cash payments and others. But we will zoom into that as well. And the last sector we selected is probably on the lowest end in terms of digital maturity, but surprisingly, it's probably the sector that has the most disruptive response to the crisis. And we would like to zoom into that and see how that disruption or digital disruption for the education system may have a much more longer lasting effect after the crisis. So if we first start with the healthcare sector on the next page. And so, as I mentioned earlier, the healthcare sector has been under significant capacity constraints to deal with the demand. And that is the number one reason where we had the lockdown in the first place, to flatten the curve. Those capacity constraints put a lot of burden in the way we operate, in the way that the hospitals operate, in the way they deal with the patients and make sure that we can treat as much as we can and save as many people as we can. But at the same time, the contrast with the different types of health services where we have limited access to basic public health services. As I mentioned earlier, in case of heart diseases, for example, some who have chronic diseases were not able to go to see their doctors and get the right treatments or the right monitoring that they need. In addition to that, supply chains in the healthcare sector have been significantly disrupted, particularly for the acquisition and procurement of medical supplies, of important medical supplies to treat the patients, from the masks and the sanitizers, but also to the ventilators and the oxygen supplies. That has put a lot of burden on most governments to deal with that. And lastly, but not only, this is not an exhaustive list, uncertainties related to medical coverage. People were not sure whether their health policy was covering the treatments or the tests for COVID-19, but also insurance companies had to grapple to find out the impact of the crisis on their financials and the write-down that they need to take into consideration. So with these challenges, that we've seen a number of use cases to sustain operations for the health sector, but also to control the pandemic, and that's probably one of the key elements in the sector. So we had the emergence of contact tracing, as you all know, Al Husn app that was launched in the UAE very successfully to control or track trace patients and potential contamination, so that we can stop or slow down the spread of the virus through the population. But we also have technologies that have been here for a while for telehealth and virtual care that somehow got accelerated following the crisis. So, for example, remote patient monitoring for COVID-19 patients has emerged as one of the key applications in several countries, where you can continue to monitor the situation of COVID-19 patients that are not severely affected and do not need immediate treatment in hospitals. They can continue to be monitored while they stay at home in quarantine, of course, but have a 24-hour contact with their health providers to check their health, and potentially, if their condition worsens, then they will be directed to the right service. And so that also accelerated the thinking about telehealth in general and virtual care in general. As I mentioned, these technologies existed before, but probably COVID-19 has been the real check or the real proof that these solutions work. And more institutions are now thinking of adopting telehealth more aggressively or more intensively to treat patients beyond COVID-19 and for types of chronic diseases or elderly care and others. Talking about other use cases in the healthcare, primarily around data analytics and business intelligence. Here we list two specific use cases that we have been emerged during the crisis. One with relation to supply and demand matching for patients and beds, hospital beds and medical equipment and workforce. And the reason being, as I mentioned earlier, the health providers have been overwhelmed with the crisis, and there was not enough capacity to manage all the patients or distribute the patients between several service providers or several hospitals. And so business intelligence solutions emerged as one of the means to optimize all this and match more efficiently patients and hospitals and hospital beds. The second part is, I mentioned earlier, challenges with procurement related to medical supplies. And so supply chain optimization and use cases, business intelligence use cases around supply chain optimization also emerged as some of the technologies that accelerated their adoption during the crisis to deal with that. And I'm sure many others. So that's with the healthcare. Moving on to financial services. As I mentioned earlier, in the financial services sector, we've all been familiar with online banking and mobile apps and all, but the financial sector has been hit. Although they continue to operate, our banks, thanks God, continued to operate during the lockdown. but they sustained important implications. So first of all, as you know, interest rates have gone down, debt default has gone up. That puts a lot of pressure on the banking system from the revenue as well as from the cost point of view. And so they have significant cost pressures that they need to deal with to sustain their financials. They were overwhelmed from the infrastructure and the call center point of view. People can no longer go to the bank to open their account or cash their money or get any type of service from their bank. And so call centers were under a lot of pressure to deal with all the demand from the customers, but also technological infrastructure has been also strained during this period. But also what was interesting is that the contrast between traditional banks and emerging online banks has gone much faster. So you know that if you were to open an account, and actually as a matter of fact, I opened 2 accounts during the lockdown, one with an online bank and one with a traditional bank that is online. And I did that online, except that the traditional bank asked me to come to the agency to authenticate my signature. And the online bank, I got my account open within 15 minutes. And so obviously these kinds of situations push banks to rethink their approach to new digital products and services. And so there will be more and more development of partnerships with fintechs, first of all, but also development of new products and services, such as cashless payments, digital wallets, and others that we know will be more efficient in the future in case of another crisis, but also to remain competitive in a market where online banking all of a sudden gained a lot of traction. As I mentioned earlier, call centers and infrastructure has been strained as well. And so there has been a lot of focus on how can we adjust our call centers to respond to the overwhelming demand, particularly from the performance improvement point of view, but also from the infrastructure point of view, and the launch of digital solutions to serve our customers, such as chat rooms and chat bots and others. Technology, as I mentioned, has been one of the key components in the financials of the bank, and so the banking system has been looking closely at how to optimize costs for their technologies, and one of those solutions is to migrate to cloud for 2 reasons. One is to optimize their economics, their costs, but also to be more agile and to be more scalable in case of another peak or another wave in the banking system to use online services. Cloud has emerged, and migration will continue to evolve in the banking sector from physical infrastructure to cloud services. Also, if we think longer term, we will think modern delivery, agile delivery for the traditional banks to be able to introduce products and services, digital products and services faster and be more competitive in the market. Lastly, I would like to move to the education sector. As I mentioned earlier, in the education sector on the next page, thank you. The education sector has probably been the least digitally mature before the crisis. Everybody goes to school, everybody goes to university. It's a very regulated system. We need to get our certificates in a certain manner. But the crisis came as a big surprise to the sector, as probably a wake-up call. And there were very quick reactions, and we will talk about these. So first of all, how do we continue to provide education services during the crisis? And obviously, digital learning emerged as a solution, and some institutions were able to respond within 1 week. Some took a few more weeks. Some took probably more than a month. And so obviously here, digital ability has been critical for the continuance of the education sector. But that's not the only issue, right? So as you all know, there were lots of contests or protests from parents who are complaining about education fees, and that put a lot of pressure on the financials for the universities and the schools, who are no longer needing all these school rooms and real estate. And so the users or the parents are complaining, why do we need to pay for these high fees if we are not using the real estate? And so cash flows have been a big question mark that can have a long-lasting effect on the education sector, and we will talk about that. Borderless competition, because now all of a sudden we realize that I can get a a degree in Yale out of the UAE, or I can get credits in the US and credits in France and credits in Oxford and credits in the UAE. So now there is competition all over the world. And not only I have threats from other countries, but I actually can also compete internationally. And so that opens the horizons for the education sector in terms of threats as well as opportunities. And I think the winners will be those that will adjust their business models to the new reality. And probably the education sector is probably the one where I'm more convinced that there will be a new reality. We need to adjust our business models to this. And unfortunately, historically, there were no strategy for an integrated digital or edutech strategy in the education system. And I think the crisis has been a real wake-up call with the emergence and success of digital learning. And so going forward, what is going to happen? We believe that there will be more and more digital adoption for the education system, not only to deliver the trainings, but also to operate the universities and operate the schools. We will see more and more of data analytics to enhance the education performance and be able to track the students' performance and tweak their education or their track to the most successful programs for them. And the more we use digital learning, the more we have data on them, and the more we will be able to adapt and use the digital, the intelligence and machine learning to actually provide the most advanced curriculum or developments for the students. We will see paperless efficiencies for the entire workflow in the education system, from the moment we apply to a school to the moment we graduate, all along the way with the obviously the learning, the distance learning, and the analytics and all. So we will see more and more of an integrated workflow in the education system. But the last one is the micro-credentials, and I talked earlier about borderless competition. And this is going to really disrupt the education system in the probably in the medium term, where not only now I can compete internationally and I have threats from international education centers, but now it's not going to be paid by semester. You know, you're going to pay by credits. I can get a credit from here, a credit from there, a credit from here, and I will be able to go enter the workforce with probably a much more tailored and much more successful career after that. So we believe that education will probably one of those sectors that will have a rather longer lasting effect after the crisis. So that's from the sector point of view. Before we hand over to Paul, I wanted to also take a functional lens as to the spend in technology and emergent technologies. And so based on a survey on the spend pre-COVID and post-COVID in technologies, obviously there is the first reaction to the crisis, which is how do I deal with my operations? And therefore, how do I deal with my customers? How do I deal with my sales and therefore, it's not surprising to see that there is an increase, a much bigger increase in customer service and sales and marketing in terms of IT spend in those areas, so that we can continue to serve our clients and not disrupt our business. Obviously, importantly, risk and compliance is another area that has an even a stronger effect, given the threats that Paul will tell us about. In contrast to that, IT spend is gone down drastically because now we don't need to invest as much in infrastructure. Actually, we don't have time to invest so much in infrastructure because we need to move to the cloud, and that will be faster. And therefore, the IT spend has gone down, but the customer service, sales and marketing, and risk and compliance have gone up. And this, at least for the immediate term. I would like now to hand over to Paul to tell us, zoom specifically into risk and compliance and the effect of the crisis on how we are dealing with the risks and compliance. Paul?
Thanks, Wajdi. So up to now, we've covered what the digital landscape looks like in the wake of the current pandemic, as well as the current challenges and threats that are facing organizations in this new way of working. Wajdi presented on how the enforced workplace restrictions have accelerated digital transformation across the healthcare and financial services sectors. So this next section will cover how the change in the working conditions introduces the need for technology resiliency, bringing with it also the increase and rapid rise of the new cyber threats. So the global response to COVID-19 has led to the emergence of a new normal for consumers and enterprises. Amid the COVID-19 crisis, the resiliency of technology systems is being tested like never before. Organizations with key gaps in their systems resiliency are experiencing adverse impacts to business continuity. They are seen as digital stragglers by the market, resulting in negative financial impact. So the resiliency of critical business services and technology systems is a key need now and beyond. I'll start by taking us through, at a high level, how organizations adjust to the new normal. So as organizations navigate this crisis, they are pressed to scale up the surge in usage of digital channels and the accommodation of remote working while operating in this constrained environment. So in particular, organizations are still grappling with the following three changes. So change number one, ensuring seamless engagement experience for consumers. So what this means is the traditional business models are being reinvented as consumers turn to online shopping, e-banking, telemedicine, and online entertainment. And enterprises are also enabling their workforce with the use of video conferencing and online collaboration tools. This is to ensure that the businesses remain operational. Change number two, this brings with it an increased threat from cyber attack vectors. So malicious actors are exploiting the current fear and uncertainty to target individuals and businesses. We have seen a significant increase in phishing and spear phishing emails, malware, and ransomware attacks in the recent months. Change number three of adjusting to the new normal is there's also been a changes to remote working and workforce productivity. So workforce productivity may be impacted by current connectivity challenges and lower performance of corporate systems. So this would result in a significant increase in employees working remotely. Alongside the adjustments to the new normal, there have also been some environmental challenges that we've seen. So while responding to this new normal, technology leaders will still be expected to deliver systems that are resilient in an operating environment with new or increased challenges. So the three challenges that I'll be covering, number one, a potential reduction in funding for technology initiatives. So as businesses are experiencing constrained revenue growth, the funding available for new technology initiatives may be limited, which have a radical impact on technology investment plans going forward. Challenge number two is the continued business continuity risks. So with the supply chain disruptions and the unavailability of critical resources and frontline staff, customer services have been highly disrupted. This is due to reduced availability of contact center operations and gaps in business continuity planning and measures, all posing significant risks to business continuity. And finally, the challenge number three is the inflexible service contracts for all our outsourced technology components. So there's typically a heavy reliance placed on organizations who provide us managed services footprints. These contracts are typically based on peak demand or known usage patterns. So COVID-19 has redefined all these perimeters as end users have radically changed their behavior and continue to do so. Mitigating this cost and service level risk requires a combined effort of the organization and the partner ecosystem. Next, I'll be going over the key imperatives for technology resilience. So to help organizations become resilient and preserve continuity of business operations, given these new complications, we typically encourage our clients to consider the below 5 key imperatives. So imperative number one, define what's important and worth protecting. It will be good for your organizations to define technology backbones and identify potential bottlenecks. With this information on hand, you can ensure mitigation strategies in place that would impact your critical business processes. This is especially important as any point of failure in your IT systems could majorly impact productivity of your remote workforce. Imperative number two is plan and test for unexpected events. So this involves scenario modeling as well as conducting stress testing, performance design, and tuning. This will help to mitigate against the bottlenecks and key risks for the technology backbone that supports your business. Some of our mature clients have designed alternative experiences for customers in critical performance capabilities. Imperative number three is monitor and measure all metrics that matter. This includes defining and monitoring service level indicators and ensure they are supported by a plan to react if a failure had to happen. Measuring these metrics is key to ensuring that continued operations of your business. Imperative number 4, leverage intelligent automation for efficiency, productivity, and continuity measures. During this COVID era, it is important that you continue investing in scaling your existing automation footprint so that you can ensure resiliency and fault tolerance. High volume tasks can be tackled at much faster speeds when automation is introduced, and this will help with optimizing the deployment of human talent to focus on more high-risk activities. And finally, imperative number 5, get ready for remote working now and the future. So organizations must continue to scale and expand connectivity and collaboration platforms. This includes your video conferencing for employees so that they could remote work and collaborate across the board. This will help with increasing the utilization and improve effectiveness of your staff. I'd like to move on to the next slide where I'll be covering the rapid rise in cyber threats and the security risks that organizations need to consider. These are focusing primarily on the remote working environment. So while the pandemic has brought about a positive spirit of cooperation and collaboration, we've also seen the inevitable flip side. So criminals and opportunists are using the pandemic to exploit a lot of security vulnerabilities. As the number of employees who work remotely increase, the number of network entry points into an organization scales significantly. This has expanded the attack surface for criminals, exposing organizations to a diversity of new cyber threats or existing cyber threats, as listed on the right-hand side of this slide. So since the outbreak, there's been an increased volume and sophistication of cyber crimes and cyber attacks conducted by nation states and organized groups and individual activists. Intelligence agencies have observed that cyber criminals were actively recruiting collaborators in the early weeks of the crisis to orchestrate large-scale phishing campaigns and maximize the impact of their attacks. As expected, much of this activity is specifically related to COVID-19, with spikes in coronavirus-related spam. So moving on to my final slide, in the prevailing conditions and off the back of the COVID-19, we believe there are 10 key risks that an organization needs to be aware of to ensure that security of their remote working infrastructure. These key risks cover technology, process, and people-related security controls. So technology is a very tactical part of remote working arrangements, and hence we believe organizations should prioritize its resiliency and security as a first step. The technology components covered on the top level of the slide in the dark blue typically cover 5 main areas. These are remote access infrastructure, remote collaboration tools, cloud services, and end-user computing devices. So for remote access infrastructure, key controls that organizations need to consider are the secure configuration of technologies such as VPN. This will help to avoid exposing your organization's sensitive data to any vulnerabilities to cyber attackers. For remote collaboration tools, key controls that organizations need to consider vary between private tools and public tools. If your organization is using one of the business tools, such as Microsoft Teams, Zoom, or what we're using now, which is WebEx, it is important to make sure you keep all your business meetings private and use a password wherever necessary. Moving on, the use of cloud services have exponentially increased in the last few months. If your organization is using cloud features, it's important to implement key controls covering things such as user access, authorization, information protection, network security, and other advanced threat protection mechanisms. Finally, for end-user computing devices, key controls that organizations need to consider include basic security techniques. This is such as data antivirus protection, latest patches, automated online backups, and also implementation of some baseline security configurations. So beyond the technology risks, organizations also need to ensure the security of business processes. As can be seen in the bottom left grouping, business processes cover 3 risk areas. These are supervision of high-risk activities, suppliers and vendors, and cyber and incident response capabilities. So for organizations that have allowed high-risk transactions, it's important to make sure that there's adequate segregation of duties in place. Additionally, remote supervision and fraud monitoring controls will be important to make sure that the high-risk transactions are run in a secure manner. For processes that are heavily dependent on critical suppliers and vendors, it is important to make sure that the organization assesses the geographical restrictions or the economic conditions of some critical suppliers. It's important to revisit these contractual obligations defined for business emergencies. And finally, organizations need to make sure that they have adequate cyber response processes in place so that they can adequately respond to any cyber attacks. Now, beyond processes and technology, security and safety of our people are paramount in the current conditions. So referring to the final two risk areas on the bottom right, a significant portion of the workforce in most of organizations are working from the offices still, so that they can cater to some of the essential business services. This requires organizations to focus heavily on environmental and physical safety of the workplace, covering things like personal hygiene and cleaning of working areas, etc. And finally, the security awareness of staff and customers are important for organizations to be able to deter cyber threats. End users can be your weakest link in the security chain of an organization, and if they are not well aware of the evolving cyber threat landscape, it could introduce a lot of extra threats to the environment. So I'd like to close off there and hand back over to Sultan so he can moderate the questions and answers.
Thank you, gents, Tim, Wajdi, and Paul. It's very interesting, very insightful. I would start with the closing that you have, Paul, and it's around the recent increase in hacks and attacks, fraudulent activities. It's worth noting that the UAE and the central bank in specific has done a very good part in combating this. There has been a recent activity during the pandemic and the lockdown, campaigns to spread awareness to the community and the public around such scams. So it's worth highlighting this because it's good to know that you're living in a community where the government and everyone at responsible positions are well aware of those threats. And I would come to as well a question that relates to your part on the cloud. You've mentioned that recently there is a trend for most of the companies to move into the cloud. So how companies can balance between updating their infrastructure and investing in their infrastructure as well in parallel with moving to cloud? Because I believe there is kind of link between both. Correct me if I'm wrong. I'm not technical, but I'll leave it to you to confirm my understanding.
Thanks. So to confirm your question, how do clients balance between the cloud on-prem infrastructure versus cloud infrastructure from a cost perspective? What do they cover? So, one of the big cloud myths is that moving to the cloud is actually cheaper. So in some cases, it does work out that way. But a lot of times when we see our clients moving to the cloud, although it may be cheaper upfront costs, they start realizing the value that they get from moving to the cloud, which eventually means they start consuming more and more cloud services and actually are enhancing their existing technologies and systems. Because, for example, you move some workloads to the cloud, and then all of a sudden you're able to leverage a AI functionality or a Power BI or dashboarding functionality with data analytics, and then you start consuming more and more cloud services going forward. But yes, the trend globally is definitely to move to the cloud. A lot of solutions only come out these days on the cloud because it's easier to manage and maintain from the vendor side as well as the organization side. Good.
And just to add to that, what we've seen locally is quite a few organizations. The truth is that in the region generally, there's been less cloud adoption than, say, in the US and the UK and in Europe for a whole host of reasons. But what we're actually seeing is, as cloud providers come to the UAE, as we see the regulators start potentially, looking at cloud, as well as the drive for collaboration tools, we're actually seeing people move. Often they'll start perhaps with Microsoft Teams, then move on to Office 365. And basically, as they get more confident and understanding about how to deliver these services securely and how to adopt cloud securely, they're getting comfortable with that. And then ultimately, moving towards a path of full platform deployment, which exactly as Paul said, really, gives you the full power of the cloud. So yeah, we'll definitely see people moving in that direction.
Thank you, gents. Another question on the impact of COVID-19, and I would say from a digital perspective as well, in line with the theme of our presentation today. So how are other sectors such as retail impacted?
Yeah, I can take this one, Sultan. So if you recall the matrix that Tim was showing the various sectors, and retail was on the, I think, the left, the slow pace, high disruption. So obviously, you saw during the lockdown that if you're brick and mortar and you have no access to go anywhere online, then you're basically shut down. If you're a pure online retailer, then you're booming, right? And then there were perhaps what the crisis has accelerated is the emergence of the in between, right? So you're a brick and mortar. You probably have you probably don't have a direct channel to go online, but then there are intermediaries, right? So you can still partner with marketplaces or with the InstaShops of the world or with the Amazons of the world to still deliver your products to your customers. And that has emerged during the crisis. And I think, and we see from many of our clients that during that crisis, many of them were grappling to go online. And those who were ready benefited from it. Those who were not ready did basically were in serious difficulties. And I think it's a wake-up call for those who were absent from the online to actually start thinking, how can I have an integrated offline, online, digital, or retail strategy, right? So you probably need to rethink. So if you're a network of shops, let's say, without getting in any particular sector, and you were offering your services offline, how can I use my logistical assets to now deliver online, perhaps more suitable products and services? So let's say if I'm a convenience store in a petrol station, right? So in that case, I was offering really convenience type of products in the shops. But in the long term, given what COVID has shown us, perhaps I can offer more than just convenience products to my customers. Perhaps I can provide, groceries, because I'm closer to the customer, and within 15 minutes I can deliver my grocery to you. But that requires that I rethink my inventory, rethink my product strategy, rethink my pricing strategy. So from that perspective, there will be long-lasting changes, because we now have to think, okay, so perhaps my entire business model is going to change, right? But keeping that extreme aside, I want to also share with you another perspective, that is the one shop, right? Not a network, one shop in a mall, right? And in the mall was closed. I don't have an online platform, and I was totally off during the crisis, during the lockdown, right? So what do I do? Yes, I can potentially partner with the marketplace to offer products, right? But how can I sustain, how can I continue to justify paying the rent in my mall after the crisis or during the crisis? And there were a lot of, I think that what the crisis has brought, and probably this is not digital in nature, but digital is only an enabler in reality, right? An enabler to a business strategy. And so what this has led us to see is that the relationship between tenants and retailers has changed. It has been changed in the past, but during the crisis, the force of the balance of power has shifted between the tenant and the retailer. And we see more and more schemes, and I'm sure you discussed that in previous webinars, Sultan, I think on retail. The balance of power has shifted, and more there are now discussions between the tenant and the retailer to have performance-based rent as opposed to a fixed rent. Performance-based meaning based on revenue, right? So that's not digital in nature, But really digital, and I'm sure everybody has been saying that, digital is just an enabler to a business strategy. Business strategies have evolved during the crisis because they were wake-up calls, and all the technology has done is, the crisis has done is probably accelerate a change that was coming anyway. You know, we were talking about this earlier. Change has been there. We have been evolving as humans. Our children are laughing at us, and our grandchildren will be laughing at our children. We were saying that we've been on a continuous change. But what happened with the crisis is maybe there was a blip, right? I don't see that blip to be, I think the blip is small, but we will continue to evolve. Technology will continue to enable that. And as a matter of fact, people are now going back to the malls. I think based on some of the research, 80% of the revenue of last July is now achieved this July, which means that, and that's without tourism. So in retail, and so that means that, you know, there's no real new normal. There is an evolution over time, and then and that was coming our way anyway. So I hope that answers your question, Sultan. I probably spread a little bit more into different topics, but I think the topic is not just, you know, what are the digital use cases. I think that's quite obvious, but I think we will see different balances of power, and we will see new business models and new strategies.
That's true. Actually, we've discussed, as you mentioned, Wajdi, this in various sessions before. We are living at the edge of the fourth industrial revolution. How things will proceed from here, no one knows. As you said, probably our kids will be laughing at us, and we were having that discussion right before the session. So it's a general disruption in all sectors, in all businesses. So and it probably COVID just accelerated it. I would take one last question before we conclude, and so I'll take this question, and then you can close from your end, gents, before I have the last word. So it seems there are a lot of risks that organizations need to consider. Like, you've covered this across the different parts of the presentation, either Tim, you, or Paul. So how can an organization manage all of these risks while ensuring business continues effectively?
Sultan. Yeah, so it is true. There's a lot of risks that come with remote working conditions, but it is important that organizations are maybe a bit flexible so that they can still operate in the current environment, but they do need to ensure that whatever they do put in place helps mitigate at least some of these failures. So how we typically do it with our clients and how we've seen it, the CISO normally takes a very senior role in supporting this initiative, helping with getting the senior management buy-in, the business leadership buy-in, educating, training, providing support across the business units, just so that the broader stakeholders understand how important security is in this time, and also before this time, and going forward, to be honest. But my suggestion is to definitely start with things such as detection-based controls. So looking at it from a monitoring perspective, and just making sure that any incident that occurs in your environment can be easily picked up and monitored so that you can respond appropriately going forward. Over to you.
Thank you, Paul. I want to thank you, gents, again for this insightful session, and thank the audience for joining us on this. Hope it was helpful and they found it insightful as well. Any last words from your end before I close?
From my side to say thanks again. Like I say, it's an honor to be partnering with Abu Dhabi Chamber on this initiative, and it was fantastic to speak to you all today. Thank you.
Indeed.
Same here. We were very glad that it was a nice journey with the whole team from KPMG and all other partners. I want to thank you again for your time today. And who knows, probably would be joining in Chamber Talk 2. There are a lot of discussions on people requesting for extending this program. Let's see how things will proceed. To our audience, stay tuned with us for next week. We have Deloitte and Saluma Partners. On Sunday, we'll discuss with Deloitte overview to operational and financial restructuring, and how to maximize value from existing operations. And with Saluma Partners, we're going to discuss restructuring and succession planning of family businesses in a pandemic. Never let a good crisis go to waste. Until then, stay safe and see you soon. Cheers.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Everyone.
Thank you.